there's a question that tends to stay quiet while the day is loud and full. And then, when everything finally goes still, it finds you. What is the point of it all? Not in a dramatic way, not in a heavy way, just quietly. You look at your life, the days, the people, the long list of things that seem to matter, and somewhere underneath it all, something goes still and asks, why all of this? Where is it going? It's one of the oldest and most honest things a human being can feel. And for most of history, people rushed to answer it, with religion, with ideology, with money, with busyness, with anything that would fill the silence and make the question go away. But there was a man who believed the bravest thing you could do was not answer it, or rather, to sit with it honestly, to stare into the quiet, and choose to live anyway. His name was Albert Camus. Over the next while, we'll follow his thinking, a series of questions any curious person might ask, somewhere genuinely surprising. It moves through one of the strangest and most famous images in all of philosophy, toward an answer almost no one sees coming. By the end, there'll be no tidy meaning of life to carry away, but perhaps something gentler and better, a way of being here that doesn't need one. So let's begin. Albert Camus was born in 1913 in Algiers, Algeria, then a French colony, to a working-class family. His father died in World War I when Camus was less than a year old. He grew up poor, raised by a nearly deaf mother who could barely read. He got tuberculosis as a teenager, which nearly killed him and would shadow him for the rest of his life. And yet, he became one of the most important writers and thinkers of the 20th century. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957. He wrote novels, plays, and essays that are still being read and argued over today. And there's something worth understanding about Camus before we get into his ideas. He wasn't a philosopher who sat in a comfortable university office, reasoning his way to abstract conclusions. He was a man who had looked at suffering up close. Poverty, disease, war, the Nazi occupation of France, which he lived through and quietly resisted as part of the French resistance. He knew what it meant for life to feel arbitrary and even brutal, and his philosophy grew directly out of that experience. So when Camus asks, what is the point of it all, he isn't asking it as an academic exercise. He's asking it as a man who had every reason to conclude there wasn't one, and who was trying to figure out what to do with that. His central idea has a name. He called it the absurd. And to understand everything that follows, we have to start there, gently, with what that word really meant to him. It's worth taking a moment over the word itself, because absurd, in Camus' sense, doesn't just mean silly or ridiculous. He meant something very specific. What he saw was a fundamental tension at the heart of human existence, a quiet collision between two things. On one side, there is the human need for meaning, and on the other, the universe's complete silence in response to that need. Let's take those slowly, one at a time. The human need for meaning. We are, as a species, meaning-making machines. We can't help it. We look at a collection of stars and we draw pictures in them, constellations, and we tell stories about what they mean. We experience a run of bad luck and we look for a cause, a reason, a pattern. We build religions and philosophies and scientific frameworks because we need the world to make sense. This isn't a flaw, it's what we are. We need coherence. We need our lives to have a shape, a beginning, a middle, an end that adds up to something. We want to know that our suffering serves a purpose, that our choices matter, that we are part of something larger than ourselves. And so, inevitably, we ask, what is the meaning of life? That question isn't random. It's the sound of that need pressing up against the world, looking for an answer. And now, the other side. The universe's silence. Here is where the difficulty lies. Look around and really look.
Nature doesn't seem to care about us. A volcano erupts, and it doesn't check whether good people live on its slopes. A child is born with a terminal illness, and there is no cosmic explanation waiting nearby. The people we love die, often too soon, often for no reason we can find. We work toward our goals, and random events overturn them. We build civilizations, and they slowly fall. And we, as individuals, will one day be gone. And in a cosmological blink, it will be as if we were never here at all. The universe, as far as we can tell, is operating according to its own physical laws and has no interest in our happiness, our suffering, or our search for purpose. It is, in Camus' word, silent. The absurd is that gap, that confrontation. The human being, desperately asking why, and the universe returning nothing but echoes. And Camus' radical move was to say that this confrontation is the central fact of human existence. You can't reason your way out of it. You can't pray your way out of it. The only real question is how you choose to respond to it. But before we get to how he answered that, there's a smaller, stranger question hiding underneath it. One we almost never stop to ask. The question, what is the meaning of life, is one nearly all of us have asked. But it's worth wondering, quietly, why we ask it at all. It seems obvious. We ask because we want to know. But Camus would press on that gently. We don't ask what is the chemical composition of water in quite the same way, with that same ache, that same urgency underneath it. The meaning of life question carries an emotional charge. It comes from somewhere. And where it comes from, Camus thought, is that gap we just described. We ask what is the meaning of life because we feel, somewhere beneath the surface, that there ought to be one, and we're troubled by the suspicion that there might not be. The question is the symptom. The absurd is the condition. And here's what's remarkable about this. The fact that you ask the question at all, the fact that you can ask it, is itself remarkable. No other creature, as far as we know, lies awake at night wondering about its own purpose. The capacity for that question is part of what makes us human. Camus didn't find this depressing. He found it extraordinary and troubling and beautiful in a strange way.
we are the beings conscious enough to notice the absurdity of our own situation. That is not nothing. That's something to sit with. And what most people do with that feeling, the ways we try to soften it or escape it altogether, is where Camus turns next. So we have the absurd, the collision between our need for meaning and the universe's silence. The question now is what people actually do with it. Camus saw several common responses, and he thought most of them were, in the end, forms of quietly running away. The first escape: religion and faith. The most common response across human history. If the universe seems silent, perhaps that's because we're not listening properly. Perhaps there is a God, a divine plan, a cosmic purpose that transcends our limited understanding. The silence isn't emptiness, it's mystery. And meaning comes from relation to the divine. Camus called this philosophical suicide. Notice, he didn't call it stupid. He didn't dismiss religious people as fools. He understood the appeal completely. But he thought that making a leap of faith to resolve the absurd was avoiding the question rather than answering it. You've silenced the discomfort by positing something you can't verify. He was particularly critical of thinkers like the philosopher Kierkegaard, who stared directly at the absurd and then leaped into faith anyway. Camus respected the honesty of seeing the problem clearly. He just thought the leap was a refusal to stay in the tension. The second escape: ideology and political meaning. If not God, then history, Marxism, nationalism, progress. The idea that we are part of a grand historical movement that will ultimately vindicate our suffering and make sense of it all. Our lives matter because they contribute to the revolution or the nation or the project of human advancement. Camus was deeply skeptical of this, partly because he had seen what happened when people subordinated themselves entirely to ideological projects. The 20th century was littered with the consequences: totalitarianism, mass violence, the reduction of individual human beings to instruments of abstract historical forces. The third escape: distraction. This one is subtler and maybe the most common today. You don't adopt a grand belief system, you just stay busy. You fill your life with work, entertainment, consumption, social media, plans, goals, anything that keeps you moving fast enough that the big question never quite catches up to you. Camus saw this as a kind of sleepwalking. You're alive, but you're not really present to your life. You've outsourced the question by simply refusing to sit still long enough to hear it. The fourth escape: literal suicide. And then there's the most extreme response. If life has no meaning, perhaps it's not worth living. Camus opens the Myth of Sisyphus with the line, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." He doesn't say this to be dramatic. He says it because he thinks it's genuinely the first question. If life has no inherent meaning, why go on? It's a logical question, and he wanted to answer it honestly, not brush it aside. His answer was, suicide is also a form of surrender. It's accepting the absurd's verdict.
that life without meaning isn't worth having, and letting that verdict win. Camus rejected it completely, not because life is secretly meaningful, but because the act of living in spite of meaninglessness is itself a form of defiance worth choosing. All of these escapes, Camus thought, share something quiet in common. Each one resolves the tension by removing one side of it. You either find a meaning through religion, through ideology, or you remove yourself through suicide, or you numb yourself through distraction. None of them actually faces the absurd. Camus wanted to face it, and the first thing facing it asks of us is an honest question about what we even are, whether we're here for a reason at all, or simply here by chance. It's a natural question, and one worth resting with for a moment. If the universe has no plan for us, if there's no cosmic author who wrote us into existence with a purpose, then what are we? Are we just a random, lucky happenstance? The honest answer from Camus' perspective is yes. We are the product of billions of years of physical processes that had no intention of producing us. Life on Earth appeared through chemistry. Consciousness emerged through evolution. You, specifically, with your particular face and memories and fears and loves, are the result of an almost unimaginably improbable chain of events, none of which were aimed at you. In that sense, yes, happenstance. But Camus would resist the word just. And this is important. The randomness of our origin doesn't determine the quality of our experience. The fact that love wasn't written into the laws of physics doesn't make the love you feel less real. The fact that beauty isn't a cosmic necessity doesn't make a piece of music less extraordinary when it moves you to tears. These things are real. They happen. They matter. Not because the universe decided they matter, but because they actually concretely, undeniably occur in conscious experience. Camus was deeply influenced by the physical world. He grew up near the Mediterranean Sea, and there's a sensory richness to his writing that's almost unusual for a philosopher. He wrote about sunlight on water, about the smell of the sea, about the pleasure of a body that is simply alive and warm and present. He wasn't a disembodied intellect floating above experience. He was someone who found the raw fact of being here almost overwhelming in its intensity. So, random? Yes. Just? Not at all. There's a strange comfort in this when you let it settle. If you weren't destined, then you're also not a disappointment to any destiny. You don't owe the universe a performance. You're simply here, inside this extraordinary and unlikely fact of consciousness, free to decide what to do with it. Which leads, almost on its own, to the next question, the one most people reach for here. If the point is simply to be alive and experience this, then surely the point is just pleasure. This is where a lot of people land when they first sit with ideas like Camus. If there's no external meaning, if we're here by chance, and the point is simply to experience life, isn't that just another way of saying the point is pleasure? Eat, drink, and be merry? It's a fair challenge, and it has a long history behind it. The ancient philosopher Epicurus basically said, yes, pleasure, or more precisely, the absence of pain, is the highest good. Live simply, avoid suffering, cultivate friendship and tranquility. That's it. And for Epicurus, this wasn't a shallow view. He wasn't talking about hedonism in the modern, party-hard sense. He meant something quieter, a life free from anxiety, free from the torment of unfulfillable desires, filled with modest pleasures and deep relationships. But Camus goes somewhere different. The distinction might be put like this. Epicurus says, minimize suffering, maximize pleasure. Camus says, be fully alive, which means being open to the whole spectrum, including the things that aren't pleasurable at all. Think about music. It would be easy to say the point of music is enjoyment. But then, what about the music we reach for when we're devastated? The peace that makes us weep? We seek that out. We need it. It isn't pleasurable in any simple sense. It's true in some way. It meets and holds something real in our experience. Or think about the people who climb mountains, knowing the summit is cold and hard and dangerous. Or artists who torture themselves for years to get something right. Or parents who sacrifice enormous pleasure for their children's well-being. Or anyone who has sat with a dying friend, not because it was pleasant, but because to be absent would have been a betrayal of something important. None of that is pleasure-seeking. All of it is something we recognize as deeply human and even admirable. Aristotle had a word for this, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but really closer to flourishing or living well. For Aristotle, living well meant exercising your capacities fully, living according to your nature as a rational and social being virtuous, engaged, and alive to what matters. Pleasure might accompany that, but it wasn't the target.
Camus is in that tradition. For him, the goal isn't comfort. It's intensity and honesty. It's showing up fully to your own life without flinching from its difficulty.
And there's a quieter, practical truth underneath all this. Human beings are notoriously bad at letting pleasure make them happy. We get what we wanted, feel a brief glow, and then adapt, and begin wanting something else. The hedonic treadmill is real. If the point of life were pleasure, we would be strangely, almost comically bad at our own purpose. The things that actually seem to sustain people, meaningful relationships, creative work, being present for others, living by one's values even when it's hard, none of these are primarily pleasures. There's something else. Something that looks, when you hold it up to the light, a great deal more like what Camus was describing. Which brings us, at last, to the image at the very center of his thinking. A man, a hill, and a boulder that will never stay at the top. Now we come to the image at the heart of Camus's philosophy, one of the most famous and most radical ideas in modern thought. The myth of Sisyphus comes to us from ancient Greece. Sisyphus was a king who cheated death, twice in fact, and as punishment, the gods condemned him to an eternity in the underworld, where he would roll a boulder up a steep hill, watch it roll back down, and push it up again. Forever. No end. No progress. No purpose. Just the repetition
endlessly, for all of eternity. The gods in the myth believed this to be the perfect punishment. What could be more terrible than futile, meaningless labor with no hope of completion? Camus took this myth and turned it upside down. In the Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, he reads this story as a perfect image for the human condition. We all, in some sense, push our boulders. We work at jobs that may not matter in any cosmic sense. We maintain relationships that require constant effort. We pursue goals that, once reached, simply give way to new goals. We age. We lose things. We start over. We age some more. Futile, meaningful, the rock keeps rolling back. But here's Camus's radical move. He ends the essay with one of the most striking sentences in all of philosophy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy. Not resigned. Not numb. Not grimly enduring. Happy. How? Why? Because Sisyphus, in Camus' reading, is conscious. He knows his situation. He sees clearly what he's doing and why it will never add up to a grand purpose. He has no illusions. And in that clear-eyed awareness, in the very act of refusing to be crushed by his situation, he finds something. Not meaning handed to him from outside, but rebellion, defiance, the act of continuing, of pushing the boulder again, not because it will go anywhere, but because he chooses to, because the act of pushing is his.
There's a moment Camus describes that is genuinely moving. It's the moment when Sisyphus watches the boulder roll back down the hill. He's at the top. He has to walk back down and begin again. That walk, what is it?
Camus says, that is Sisyphus's moment, his most human moment, the time when he is separated from his labor and must simply exist with his situation. And in that moment, if he chooses to be conscious rather than crushed, if he owns his fate rather than being owned by it, he is, in that strange way, free. The boulder doesn't change. The hill doesn't change. What changes is the relationship Sisyphus has to his own life. This is not quite a comfortable idea. Camus isn't offering a warm blanket. He's offering something harder, and, if you're willing to take it, something far more powerful. The ability to be fully alive precisely because you hold no illusions. So what does that look like once you climb back down the hill and step into an ordinary life? That's where Camus becomes surprisingly practical. So we have the theory. But what does Camus' revolt actually look like inside an ordinary human life? He wrote about 3 expressions of it, what he called the 3 consequences of the absurd: revolt, freedom, and passion. Revolt doesn't mean anger or political uprising, though it can include those. It means the ongoing, daily refusal to pretend. It means choosing to stay awake to your situation, to keep the question alive rather than anesthetizing yourself. Every morning you wake up and you know what you're doing and why it doesn't have a cosmic guarantee, and you do it anyway. That's revolt. Freedom. This one is counterintuitive. You might think that if life has no meaning, that would feel constrictive or terrifying. Camus thought the opposite. Once you stop waiting for an external authority to validate your choices. Once you stop asking, but is this the right purpose, the true meaning, you're genuinely free to choose. The absence of prescribed meaning is the condition for authentic freedom. You're not following a script. You're writing one. Passion, live with intensity. Don't save yourself. Don't defer experience. Don't tell yourself you'll really start living once you've achieved this or sorted out that. The person who lives absurdly, for Camus, throws themselves into life with full commitment, not because it will last forever, but precisely because it won't. He puts it this way in the Myth of Sisyphus: the absurd man does not aim at quantity of life, but at quality and variety of experience. He's not trying to accumulate. He's trying to be here. And here's where Camus connects to something a lot of people feel but struggle to articulate. Most of us have had moments, maybe brief, where everything clicks, where you're so present in what you're doing or who you're with that the question of what's the point simply doesn't arise, because you're living the answer. A great conversation, a perfect afternoon, a piece of work that's going well, a moment with someone you love. In those moments, you're not asking whether life has meaning. You're too busy living it. Camus would say, that's it. That's the whole thing. Not the guarantee that those moments add up to something cosmic, but the simple capacity to be fully present inside them without needing them to be anything more than they are. But before all of this is gathered into a single answer, it's worth slowing down and following a few of these threads further into the corners of an ordinary life where the absurd shows up most quietly, into love and the things we make, into how we treat one another and how we bear what we lose, into the plainest textures of a single day. We've spoken about revolt as a way of meeting the absurd, but revolt, said on its own, can sound like a solitary thing, a single figure, awake in the dark, pushing back against the silence. So it's worth asking where other people fit into all of this, where love fits. For many thinkers, love has been a kind of doorway, a way out of the absurd rather than a way of living inside it. Love, they say, is how two souls touch something eternal. It is the promise that, against all the indifference of the universe, there is at least one bond that will not end. Camus was wary of that, not because he thought love unimportant. Almost nothing was more important to him, but because he thought this version asked love to be more than it is, and in doing so quietly missed what it actually is. In the Myth of Sisyphus, he sketches a surprising figure to make the point: Don Juan, not the cruel seducer of legend, but a man who loves fully, and often without ever pretending that any single love is forever. People call a man like that shallow. Camus says the opposite is true. Don Juan refuses the one lie that would make love easy, the lie that it only counts if it lasts for all time. He loves each person as they actually are, in the actual time that they have together. He chooses presence over permanence, quantity of real moments, rather than one moment mortgage to an eternal promise it can never keep. And underneath all of this was Camus' deepest love of all, his love of the world itself, the sea he grew up beside, the sun on warm stone, the plain, astonishing fact of being a living body in a living world. He once wrote that there is no love of life without despair of life, meaning that to love the world honestly, you have to love it while knowing it is indifferent to you, knowing it will not love you back, knowing that one day you will lose it entirely. That doesn't make the love smaller. It makes it more tender. Fragile things ask more of us and give more in return. Seen this way, love between two people is not the merging of souls for eternity. It is something quieter and braver, the choice, renewed each day, to be fully present to another mortal person. It is Sisyphus and his boulder, turned gentle. Each morning you return to the same face, the same imperfect, unguaranteed bond, and you choose it again. Not because the universe promised it to you, but because it is yours. The point was never to be loved forever. The point is to love now, with your eyes open. And there is one more way human beings answer the silence. Not by loving the world, but by adding to it, by making things. To make something is one of the oldest and most human gestures there is, and Camus thought it was also one of the most absurd, in the fullest, richest sense of that word. In the Myth of Sisyphus, he gives a whole stretch of thought to what he calls absurd creation. The absurd artist, he says, is the one who creates without appeal, without believing the work will redeem them, without believing it will last forever, or be remembered, or be understood by some watching God. The painter knows the colours will fade. The writer knows the book will, in time, be forgotten. The builder knows the cathedral will one day fall. And still, they make. Why? Because creation, for Camus, is the absurd act in its purest form. It is Sisyphus again, but this time with a brush, or a pen, or a chisel. You shape something, knowing it returns in the end to nothing, and in the shaping you are most awake, most free, most alive. To create, he wrote, is to live twice, once in the having of an experience, and again in the giving of it a form. But he set one strict condition. Absurd art describes, it does not explain. The moment a work claims to have solved the mystery, to have found the hidden meaning behind everything and tucked it neatly away, it has started to lie. The honest creator does something humbler and harder. They hold experience up to the light without resolving it. They mime the absurd rather than escaping it. There is humility in that, and defiance, both at once. Humility, because you are not building a monument to outlast time. Defiance, because you make the thing anyway, and the making turns out to be enough. The struggle itself toward the heights, Camus said, is enough to fill a human heart. The worth of the work was never in whether it survives. It was in the conscious, clear-eyed act of bringing it into being. And this isn't only for artists. Anyone who builds anything, a garden, a meal, a friendship, a life, is creating against the silence, tending something that will not last simply because the tending is good. The point is not permanence. The point is the making. But here a darker question begins to gather. If nothing is guaranteed, if there is no cosmic rule and no final judge keeping score, then is anything truly forbidden? If the universe is silent, does its silence permit absolutely anything at all? This is the objection that has followed absurd thought like a shadow for as long as it has existed. If life has no given meaning, then surely nothing matters. And if nothing matters, then cruelty is permitted just as easily as kindness. Many people have drawn exactly that conclusion and acted on it. Camus spent years answering it, and his answer lives in the book he considered his most important work, The Rebel, published in 1951. His first move is quiet and surprising. The absurd, he agrees, begins in solitude, one person, alone, facing the silence. But watch what happens, he says, the moment that person rebels, the moment they look at something and say, "No, this is not acceptable." In that single word, something appears that was not there before. To say no is to draw a line, and to draw a line is to affirm that there is a limit, that there is something on the other side of it worth defending. Think of the person who has endured and then finally refuses. In refusing, they are saying that there are things that may not be done to a human being. A value is born in that refusal, a value that pure isolation never revealed. And so Camus rewrites the most famous line in philosophy. Descartes had said, "I think, therefore I am." Camus answers, "I rebel, therefore we are." Rebellion doesn't reveal a lonely me. It reveals an us, a shared dignity that belongs to everyone. So meaninglessness does not mean that anything goes. In fact, Camus argues the exact opposite. He had watched, in his own century, where the other road leads, the belief that nothing is true, and therefore everything is permitted. He had seen it end in the guillotine and the camp, in murder carried out coldly in the name of history, justified by some promised paradise always waiting just over the horizon. And he refused it completely. The rebel, he says, must say no to oppression, but must also, and just as fiercely, refuse to become an oppressor. The one who kills for tomorrow's utopia betrays the very solidarity that rebellion revealed in the first place. And so Camus places a word at the center of his ethics: limit, measure. The idea that revolt which forgets its own limit slowly becomes the very thing it set out to fight. True revolt keeps faith with the actual human being standing in front of you, here, now, and refuses to sacrifice that person to an abstraction, however grand. This was the conviction that broke his long friendship with Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre, in those years, could justify revolutionary violence as the price of progress. Camus could not and would not. He would rather be wrong and gentle than right and cruel. So the ethics that grow from the absurd are not a void at all. They are a fragile, demanding kind of solidarity. We are all together inside the same silence, and that shared condition is precisely why we owe one another tenderness, and precisely why some lines must never, ever be crossed. And the hardest test of that solidarity, the place where the silence presses down on us most heavily of all, is loss, the death of those we love. There is no part of the absurd that asks more of us than this one. Camus knew grief early, and knew it from the inside. His father died before he was old enough to remember him, killed in the opening months of the First World War, a man his son would know only through a single second-hand story. He grew up alongside death in other forms too. the poverty, the silence of his home, and the illness in his own lungs that nearly took him while he was still a boy. And death moves all through his writing. The Stranger opens with the plainest, most famous sentence ever written about a mother's death. The plague is, in the end, one long act of watching people die and refusing to look away. And its hardest passage, the death of a child, is written so carefully that no easy comfort is left standing afterward. So what does the absurd actually offer to someone who is grieving? Less than religion offers, and Camus knew that and never pretended otherwise. He offers no reunion, no promise that the loss was part of a hidden plan, no quiet voice assuring you it was meant to be. He believed those comforts, however tender, asked the mourner to look away from the truth of what has happened, and the absurd asks for something harder instead, to grieve honestly, to let the loss be exactly as large as it really is. But there is something offered in return, and it is not nothing. If there is no eternity, then the time you were given with someone was not a rehearsal for some truer life waiting elsewhere. It was the whole of it, and that makes it precious rather than provisional. The person you loved was here, fully, really here, and so were you, and that happened, and there is no force anywhere that can reach back and make it not have happened. Grief, seen this way, is simply the shape that love takes once its object is gone. To mourn someone deeply is the clearest possible proof that you loved them without illusion. And the dead, Camus would say, are honoured not by waiting to rejoin them somewhere beyond, but by living the way they no longer can, by being awake to the ordinary days they don't get to have. At the end of the plague, Dr. Rieu finds no meaning in the deaths he has witnessed. There is no lesson that makes them acceptable. What he finds instead is something quieter and steadier, a resolve to bear witness, to remember, to keep faith with the ordinary people who suffered and not let them be forgotten. That is the absurd answer to grief. Not consolation, fidelity. And here, perhaps, is where that single sentence belongs, the one Camus left behind, as if for exactly these nights. In the depth of winter, he wrote, he finally learned that within him there lay an invincible summer. The winter is the grief, and the summer is not a denial of it, and never was. It is simply what remains when you have loved the world enough to mourn it, and you choose, even so, to go on. And there are quieter threads still to follow. The shape of our ordinary days, the passing of time, the body and the world it moves through, the company we keep. They all lead in the end to the same place, but they are worth walking slowly, one at a time. Of all the places the absurd can find a person, the most ordinary is also the most common. It finds us at work, in the routine, in the long, repeating shape of an ordinary week. Camus knew this, and he wrote about it with unusual plainness. There is a passage in the Myth of Sisyphus that many people recognize the moment they hear it. He describes the rhythm of a modern life. Rising in the morning, the tram or the train, 4 hours at a desk or a bench, a meal, the tram again, 4 more hours, another meal, and then sleep, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, all following the very same path, week after week, mostly without trouble. We follow it easily he says most of the time. But one day, the why arises.
That is his phrase. One ordinary day, in the middle of the routine, something quietly gives way, and the whole rhythm is suddenly lit by a single question. Why? Why this? Why all of it? Why again tomorrow? Camus says this moment arrives with a particular feeling, and his description of it is precise. A weariness tinged with amazement. Weariness, because the machinery of the days has worn at you. And amazement, because for the first time, you are truly seeing the machinery at all. Most of us treat that moment as something to be fixed or fled, a bad mood, a sign we need a holiday, or a new job, or simply more sleep. But Camus saw it differently. That moment, he thought, is not a malfunction. It is an awakening. It is consciousness coming online inside a life that had been running on its own. The weariness is the beginning of seeing clearly. And this is exactly where Sisyphus belongs, not only in the underworld, but here, in the office, in the kitchen, on the factory floor. Sisyphus is the patron of everyone who does the same task again tomorrow, knowing it will need doing again the day after. The question is never whether the boulder rolls back. It always rolls back. The question is whether you do the work asleep, resentful and absent, or whether you do it awake, with your eyes open, knowing exactly what it is and choosing it anyway. Camus is not promising that this makes the work meaningful in some cosmic sense. The spreadsheet is not secretly holy. The commute is not a pilgrimage. What he offers is smaller and truer, that the same hours, lived consciously rather than slept through, become yours. The routine does not change. What changes is whether you are present inside it or merely carried along by it. And if so much of a life is made of repetition, the same days, the same tasks, returning and returning, then a deeper question begins to press underneath the work itself. Not what we do with the hours, but what we make of their passing. The question of time. Time is the quiet ground that everything else in the absurd stands upon. The universe is silent, and it is also passing. We are here, and then, in a cosmological blink, we are not. Camus never let himself forget that, and he thought most of human unhappiness comes from the particular way we try to forget it. We do it, he noticed, by living in the future, by leaning forward always toward what comes next. There is a striking line where he describes a man who is, in his words, longing for tomorrow, when everything in him ought to reject it, because tomorrow is precisely what carries him toward his own ending. We chase the next thing, the next milestone, the weekend, the holiday, the someday when life will finally begin in earnest. And in doing so, we hand over the only thing we actually have, which is the present, in exchange for a future that is never quite here. Camus was suspicious even of hope, at least of a certain kind of it. Not the warm, everyday hope that gets us out of bed, but the deeper habit of betting the present against the future, of telling ourselves that this moment doesn't really count, that it is only a corridor towards some better room further on. He thought that habit was a quiet way of refusing to be alive now. The absurd person, he wrote, lives the present and the succession of presents
before a constantly conscious soul. That is the whole discipline, not eternity, not later. This, and then this, and then this, each one fully met. And here is the strange gift hidden inside impermanence. The fact that nothing lasts is the very thing that makes anything vivid. A song you could replay forever would eventually mean nothing. A season that never ended would stop being beautiful. It is because the afternoon will end that the light through the window is worth looking at. It is because you will not always have these particular days with these particular people that they are worth being awake for at all. This is why Camus loved the figures in his work who live close to the surface of their own senses, who notice the warmth of the sun, the taste of salt, the weight of the air before rain. They are not wiser than the rest of us exactly. They are simply more present. They have stopped postponing their lives. So the absurd does not ask you to deny that time is running out. It asks the opposite, to feel it, gently, and to let that feeling pull you back into the only moment that was ever really yours. The point was never to save your life for later. It was to be here while it is happening. And the place where the present is felt most completely is not in thought at all. It is lower than that, and simpler. It is in the body, and in the world the body moves through. For all that Camus is remembered as a philosopher of the absurd, a thinker of silence and futility, there is something easy to miss about him. He was, before anything else, a man in love with the physical world. Sun on skin, the smell of the sea, the shock of cold water, the warmth of stone, the simple, almost overwhelming pleasure of being a living body in a living landscape. He grew up beside the Mediterranean, poor in everything except light, and that light never left his writing. In his early essays, collected in a small book called Nuptials, he describes mornings at the old Roman ruins of Tipasa, where the sea and the sun and the wild flowers among the broken stones produced in him something close to ecstasy. He called it a kind of marriage between a person and the earth, not a retreat from the hard truths of existence, but a direct, wordless answer to them. This is the part of Camus that keeps his philosophy from ever turning cold, because the absurd, taken only as an idea, can feel like a problem to be argued. But Camus did not finally meet the silence with an argument. He met it with his senses. When the mind spirals toward why any of it? Why bother? Where is it going? The body offers a different kind of reply. The water is cold. The sun is warm. This is happening. You are here. There is no need to solve the universe to feel the wind change. There is no cosmic permission required to taste fruit, or to swim, or to stand still in a field at dusk and feel the day cooling around you. These things do not depend on meaning. They simply are, and in being fully present to them, the question of the point quiets, not because it has been answered, but because for a moment it has stopped needing to be. Camus was honest enough to hold both truths at once. He once wrote that there is no love of life without despair of life, that the very intensity of his joy in the world was inseparable from his knowledge that it would end, that he would lose the sea and the sun and the warm stone, that the body that took such pleasure in being alive was the same body that would one day fail. He did not look away from that. He let the despair and the love sharpen one another. The world is more beautiful, not less, for being something we are passing through.
So the answer the body gives is not a denial of the absurd. It is the absurd, fully lived. To be here, awake in your own skin, present to the plain miracle of sensation, sun, water, breath, warmth, is its own quiet form of revolt. It is the world saying without words that it was worth showing up for. But there is one more thing the body knows, beyond sun and sea. It knows the presence of others, the warmth of company, and that may be the deepest answer of all. We began this whole journey with a solitary image, one person awake in the dark, facing the silence alone. And much of the absurd does begin there, in solitude. But Camus did not think we were meant to stay there. Some of the warmest and most human moments in all his writing are about the simplest thing of all, the company of another person. Friendship. In his novel, The Plague, set in a city sealed off and dying, almost everything is grim. People are separated from those they love. The dead are counted by the hundreds. And yet, at the very center of the book, there is a scene that readers remember long after the rest has faded. Two men, Dr. Rieu, who has spent months treating the sick, and his friend Tarot, who has chosen to help him, step away from the suffering for a single evening. They go down to the sea, and they swim together in the dark water, under the night sky, side by side, matching each other's rhythm, saying almost nothing. Nothing is solved by it. The plague is still there when they come back out of the water. No one is saved by a swim. But Camus presents that hour as something close to sacred. Two friends, in the middle of a catastrophe with no meaning, choosing for a moment to be simply, fully present to one another. It is a pause of pure fraternity, and in a universe that offers no comfort of its own, that shed warmth between two people is not a small thing. It may be the largest thing there is. This is where the absurd turns, quietly, from something lonely into something shared. If we are all here together inside the same silence, all of us asking the same unanswerable question, all of us facing the same ending, then the most natural response is not to compete or to despair alone, but to turn toward each other, to say, in effect, you too, then let us at least be here together. Camus thought that recognition, the simple sight of another person carrying the same burden, was the beginning of everything decent in human life. Friendship, in this light, is not a distraction from the hard truth. It is the hard truth, met in the best possible company. It asks nothing of eternity. It does not pretend the bond will last forever, or that it has been written into the stars. It is just this. Two people, mortal and unguaranteed, choosing to walk beside one another for as long as the road allows, to listen, to help, to swim out into the dark water together, and then come back. And so the solitary figure we began with is not really alone after all. None of us is. And yet, strange as it may sound after all of that, there remains a part of this that each of us can still only meet by ourselves.
there is a kind of solitude that no friendship can quite reach. Camus thought it was not something to fear, but something to make peace with. Camus carried two things in tension for the whole of his life, and never tried to resolve them, because he didn't think they could be. One was solidarity, the warmth of others, the fraternity we've just spoken of. The other was solitude. He even gave a book a title that holds both at once, Exile and the Kingdom. We are, all of us, a little of both, in exile and yet somehow home. Because here is a simple truth the friendship cannot soften. There is a core of your experience that no one else can enter. No one can be tired in your body, or carry your particular fears, or stand in your place at the very end. When you wake in the small hours and the old question comes, why all of it? Where is it going? It comes to you alone. The company of others is real and precious, but it does not reach all the way down. Somewhere underneath it, each of us keeps a room that only we can sit in. Most of us are a little frightened of that room. We fill it with noise, with screens, with plans, with chatter, precisely so that we never have to sit in it for long. But Camus thought that was a mistake. Solitude, met honestly rather than fled, is not a punishment. It is where you finally meet yourself, not the self of your roles and performances and the face you wear for others, but the bare, quiet fact of your own being, the silence outside, the one the universe answers our questions with, turns out to have a silence that answers it from within. And that inner silence, Camus found, is not empty at all. This is the difference between loneliness and solitude, and it matters. Loneliness is the ache of something missing, a person, a connection, a sound you wish were there. Solitude is something else, the quiet fullness of being present with yourself, needing nothing added. The absurd person can be alone without being lonely, because they have stopped waiting for the universe, or anyone in it, to come and tell them they are real. They already know they are here. That is enough. Remember that line of his, the one about the depth of winter and the invincible summer. Notice where a thing like that is actually found. Not in a crowd, not in applause. It is found alone, in the quiet, in exactly the room most of us are afraid to enter. The summer, he means, is not given by anyone else. It is what is left when everything external falls away, and you discover that you are still there, still breathing, still, somehow, at home in your own company. So solitude, for Camus, is not the opposite of a full life. It is part of its rhythm. We go out to others, and we come back to ourselves, and both are necessary, and neither is complete without the other. And what that inner quiet finally opens onto, once you stop being afraid of it, is not emptiness. It is something closer to astonishment. The plain, almost unbelievable fact that there is anything here at all. Think back for a moment to where the absurd first wakes up in a person, that ordinary day in the middle of the routine, where the question why finally breaks the surface. Camus described the feeling that comes with it as a weariness tinged with amazement. We have spent a long time with the weariness. It is worth ending with the amazement, because they are two halves of the very same awakening, the same consciousness that can look at existence and ask, with a kind of ache, why is there any point to this? Can also look at the very same existence and simply marvel that it is here at all. These are not opposite responses. They come from the same place, from being awake enough to notice your own situation. The question and the wonder are twins.
And what is there to wonder at? Only everything. That there is something rather than nothing. That a small clump of matter on an ordinary planet somehow woke up and can taste salt and feel warmth and fall in love and grieve and look up at a sky full of distant fire and ask what it all means. Earlier, we called you a lucky happenstance. Here is the other side of that same coin. The odds against your being here at all. This particular you, awake on this particular night, are so vast that the only honest response is not despair, but astonishment. Wonder asks nothing. It does not need the universe to explain itself, or to promise anything, or to last. It does not try to solve the silence. It simply receives what is here, with open hands, the way a child does before anyone has taught them that the world is ordinary. And the truth Camus kept returning to is that the world is not ordinary. We only call it that because we have stopped looking. The miracle was never somewhere else. It was the cup of coffee, the light through the window, the sound of rain, the breath you are taking right now without trying. This is perhaps the gentlest face of everything Camus called revolt. Not anger, not defiance with a clenched fist, but something quieter and stronger. The refusal to be bored by a world this strange. The decision to stay amazed. To meet a silent, indifferent universe, not with bitterness, but with a kind of helpless gratitude that you got to be here at all, even briefly, even without a reason. And maybe that is as close to an answer as the absurd will ever give. Not a meaning handed down from above, not a purpose written into the stars. Just this, the bare, astonishing fact of being here, awake for a little while, able to wonder at any of it, which is, of course, the very thing we have been circling from the beginning, the quiet question underneath the work and the time, the body and the friendship, the solitude and the wonder. The question that brought us here, and that Camus spent his life learning how to live alongside. What is the point of it all? And Camus' honest answer to that question is, at first, a hard one. There isn't one. Not handed to us from outside. Not inscribed in the nature of things. Not waiting to be discovered. And then, before you feel the floor drop out from under you, he adds, and that's okay. Here's the reframe. The question, what is the point, assumes that there should be a point, and that it should come from somewhere other than us. It assumes the universe owes us a purpose. Camus says, drop that assumption. Not because nothing matters, but because that way of framing it guarantees disappointment. The point, to the extent there is one, is the living of it. But not passively. Not just letting life happen while you scroll through it. Consciously. Awake. With full knowledge of your situation. Think about it this way. Imagine two people going through the same day. They do the same things. Work, eat, talk to people, come home, sleep. One of them is half present, moving through the routine on autopilot, vaguely waiting for something that will make it feel meaningful. The other is here, noticing things, engaged, present to the people around them, aware that this day will not come again.
Which of those people is more alive? Camus' philosophy is essentially a sustained argument for being the second person, for waking up to your own life. And here's the quietly radical thing about that. It doesn't require any particular belief. You don't have to sign up to a religion or a political program. You don't have to resolve the big metaphysical questions. You just have to stop sleepwalking. You have to decide that this, right here, this ordinary, impermanent, beautiful, difficult life is worth showing up for.
That might sound simple. It's actually one of the hardest things in the world, because our default is to be elsewhere, to be planning, worrying, distracted, numbed, to be anywhere but here.
The absurd is the reminder that keeps calling us back. The big questions aren't problems to be solved once and then filed away. They're invitations to keep waking up. Of course, Camus isn't the only one to have stood at this edge and looked over. It's worth, briefly, hearing the others. Let's put Camus in conversation with a few alternatives, because he doesn't get to claim the field alone. First, against Camus, the religious answer. Most of the world's great religious traditions would say Camus is wrong, not because he's asking the wrong question, but because he's cut himself off from the answer. There is a purpose. There is a God, or an ultimate reality. The silence Camus hears is not emptiness, but the limit of unaided human reason. Faith is not running away. It's a different kind of knowing. This is a serious position. Camus heard it and chose not to take the leap. Many thoughtful, honest people do take it. The disagreement here isn't between the smart and the foolish. It's between two different responses to the same situation, and both deserve respect. Next, against Camus, the existentialist answer. Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus' famous contemporary and eventually his rival, agreed that existence precedes essence. We have no pre-given nature or purpose, but Sartre thought we create meaning, genuinely and authentically, through our choices and commitments. We're radically free, and with that freedom comes the responsibility to construct a meaningful life. Camus thought Sartre was too optimistic, that calling our self-created meanings real meaning was still flinching from the absurd. Sartre thought Camus was stuck in a kind of passive anguish that didn't account for genuine human agency. They fell out, famously. And then, alongside Camus, certain Buddhist ideas.
Interestingly, some strands of Buddhist thought land close to Camus. The idea that suffering arises from attachment and craving, from wanting the world to be other than it is, maps onto the absurd in an interesting way. The Buddhist emphasis on present moment awareness, on releasing the demand that things be permanent and meaningful in a fixed way, resonates with Camus's revolt.
He arrived there through pure philosophy rather than contemplative practice, but the destination has a recognizable shape. The honest conclusion is that Camus doesn't win the argument by default, but he asks the right question and he refuses the easy exits. And that, in itself, is worth something. It's one thing to hold all of this as an idea. It's another to watch it carried into a life. Camus gave us that too, in a quiet, devastating novel about a city under siege. It's worth staying a moment with the plague, Camus' 1947 novel, because it shows his philosophy in action rather than in theory, and because it remains one of the most quietly relevant books of the last century. The novel is set in Oran, in Algeria, where a plague has descended on the city. It follows Dr. Bernard Rieu, who spends the book treating the sick day after day, knowing that most of his patients will die and that he cannot stop the epidemic. Why does he keep going? Not because he thinks he'll win, not because God has promised the effort is meaningful, not because history will remember him. He keeps going because there are people who are suffering in front of him, and it is within his power to do something about it, however small. That's it. That's the whole reason. And Camus presents this as the highest expression of human goodness, not heroism born from certainty, but commitment born from clear-eyed love in the face of futility. The plague in the novel was also widely read as an allegory for the Nazi occupation, the moral question being not whether you can win against an overwhelming force, but whether you choose to resist or collaborate, whether you stay awake or go numb. Dr. Rieu is Sisyphus with a stethoscope. He knows the boulder will roll back. He pushes it anyway. And in the pushing, in the choosing, there is something Camus would call dignity, not triumph, not meaning in the cosmic sense, simply dignity. And so we come, slowly, to the end of the road we've been walking, and to whatever it is we're meant to carry home from it. So, what is the point of it all? Let me try to gather everything we've covered into something you can carry with you. Camus' starting point. You are a conscious being in an indifferent universe, and you cannot help asking what your life means. That collision between your need and the silence is the absurd. It's not a problem to be solved. It's the fundamental condition of being human. Most people respond to this by running into faith, into ideology, into distraction, into numbness. Camus says, don't run, stay, look at it. Because when you stay, when you really accept that there is no externally guaranteed meaning, something unexpected happens. You're free. Not free in a reckless, nihilistic sense. Free to actually choose. To decide what matters to you. To commit to it fully. To live it without waiting for the universe to co-sign your choices. And the life that emerges from that choice? It's richer, not poorer, for the lack of guarantee. The love you feel is more precious because it's fragile. The beauty you encounter is more striking because it's fleeting. The people you connect with matter more because none of you are here forever. Sisyphus, at the top of the hill, watching the boulder roll back, he has two options. He can be crushed by the futility of it, or he can own it. He can say, this is my rock, my hill, my descent, my climb. I see it clearly, and I choose it. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because he's deluded, not because it doesn't hurt, but because happiness, real happiness, isn't the absence of difficulty or the presence of guaranteed meaning. It's the presence of consciousness. It's showing up to your own life with your eyes open. That's the point. Not the meaning of life. Not a grand purpose handed down from above.
Just this: be here, be awake, refuse to be crushed, and love what is actually in front of you.
That's what Camus found. That's what he lived. Imperfectly, fully, with all his contradictions and passions and struggles. He died in a car crash in January 1960, at 46. In his pocket was an unused train ticket. He had changed plans at the last minute to get a ride with his publisher instead. Random, absurd, achingly human. He showed up until he didn't, and the work he left behind keeps asking us to do the same. If this has stayed with you, the question we started with, what is the point of it all, isn't one that gets answered once and then stays answered. Camus knew that. He thought the honest life involves returning to the question again and again, not because you haven't figured it out yet, but because staying with it is itself a form of being alive.
If you want to go deeper, the essential Camus reading is short: The Myth of Sisyphus, the philosophical essay where all of this lives. The Stranger, a novel that dramatizes the absurd from the inside. The Plague, philosophy in action, and maybe his most humane book. And The Rebel, his later work on revolt, morality, and politics. One last thing. Camus said this, and it may be the best single sentence he ever wrote. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer.
Whatever your winter looks like, hold on to that.